Hi, I'm Johnny from ultimatepapermache.com, and my little weatherproof paper mache clay toad is now finished, except for the fact that he still has to cure and then I have to paint him. But all of the actual sculpting is done now. This was a project that I started quite a long time ago. As a matter of fact, I started it before I made the leaf that I showed you in the last video. I made the leaf so that he can have something to sit on because I was afraid that he was going to break his toes if I just put him out there, and they're just really long and skinny. I did something else to those toes too. I'm going to tell you that in a minute. Now this, like I said, both of these are made with the new weatherproof paper mache clay recipe that I came up with. Actually, it's a slight variation from one that was sent to us by our friend Warren Eggleston from Australia. And he has used this very, very close to this recipe outside in Australia for several years now. And he says it works really well there. But this is Minnesota. I don't know where you live, so we don't really know how long it's going to survive outside. Now I want to jump in here real fast as my future self because I've learned a couple of things since I put the rest of this video together. And mostly what I've discovered is that I have been making some assumptions about this mixture where it's essentially all the ingredients that are normally in the original paper mache clay recipe, but we're substituting Portland cement for the flour. And because of that Portland cement in here, I've been thinking that we have to kind of treat it as almost like a concrete product rather than the original paper mache clay. But when I forgot to put plastic over this guy, I was busy with a video and with a whole bunch of stuff out in the yard, and so I intended to cure it really, really slow like you're supposed to do with a concrete product, and I didn't. It just went ahead and dried, and it's been like 82 degrees or something here in the house. I don't use an air conditioner, so it's been hot. And it dried really fast, just in like 2 or 3 days. It dried extremely hard. The new wet layer stuck just fine to the old dry layer without me putting any water on the old layer first, like you would have to do if this was concrete. And I'm just thinking the fact that it has the glue and the drywall joint compound in it actually makes it much closer to the original paper mache clay recipe than to what we would normally think of as a cement product. So even though I asked last time when I was doing the leaf, I asked for some ideas for what we should call it instead of weatherproof paper mache clay, which is kind of hard for me to say over and over again. And I got some fantastic ideas. Thank you so much for everybody for actually volunteering and thinking up names for it. That's been really cool. And obviously you can call it anything you want to. But I think I might call it a new and improved version of paper mache clay. It was really fun to work with. I really liked the way it felt when I was working with it. It went on really smoothly. I really am happy with it. I kind of wish now that I had made something bigger and had spent a little bit more time working on this guy, because I kind of rushed it. You'll see in the video. I just kind of, it was an experiment, and so I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time on him. But I'm really excited about this stuff. I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end, but now let's go ahead and see the rest of this video. Just as soon as this is all cured, then I'll seal them up, I'll paint them, and put them outside, and we'll see how long they last. Fingers crossed. I'm really, really hoping that this is going to be a really good way for us to make outdoor sculptures. I did use a pattern for it based on the kind of pattern that I used for all the little dogs in the How to Make Tiny Paper Mache Dogs. I think that's the name of my book. It's been so long since I wrote it. I'll show you a picture right there. It's just a really simple idea of drawing out the shapes that you want for the outside of your creature, and then drawing in also the shapes of a wire that you'll be using to reinforce the arms and legs. And so that's what I did. I modeled my toad after a little guy that's actually living right outside my garage door. I didn't know what they're called, that particular kind of toad. I'm not a toad expert. But I looked online and apparently it's an American toad. Now my toad is only a couple of inches long. I'm calling him my toad. That sounds kind of proprietary, doesn't it? But hey, we're friends, so is my toad. He like I said, he's just really little. And I have seen some maybe 3 or 4 inches big. I made this one a lot bigger just because it's a lot easier for me to see. I don't like working on tiny little things anymore. I just don't like it. So I made him bigger. It's totally unrealistic, but I'm having fun with it, so it doesn't matter. Let me show you how I made him. Because I didn't want to make him really tiny, I did draw out the pattern a lot bigger. So this is a giant toad, but not one of those horrible cane toads that they have down in Florida. He's just a plain old ordinary garden toad. And I drew out, like I said, the lines where we need the wires to go in order to reinforce the legs. And then I bent some heavy aluminum armature wire to match the legs that I had drawn on my pattern. He has long, skinny toes or fingers, and so I cut some much finer wire for that and just went ahead and taped it onto the ends of the arms and legs. It really doesn't matter what gauge you use, just as long as you can bend it and cut it properly. Once I had the toes on there, I taped the middle line so that everything would hold together, and then I kind of bent it into the shape that I thought would work. You know, kind of bent it down so he would be standing on his feet. Then I started using some foil and hot glue to fill out all the shapes. I made the eyeballs with a little styrofoam ball just cut in half. I stuck that on with hot glue too. I'm using the pattern not on the inside of the toad, but on the outside. I'm just kind of putting them on there and seeing how fat I needed to make it and just adding a little bit more foil wherever I need it. Basically just sculpting the same way you would if you were using clay. If you're not familiar with making armatures with aluminum foil and hot glue, I would recommend the video series I did on the blue Egyptian hippo. The aluminum foil is a fantastic way of making an armature. It offers a lot of support. The paper mache clay is going to get into all the dips and crannies of the aluminum foil, which acts very much like a mesh. So it really adds a lot of reinforcement. And it isn't paper. I'm not going to use any crumpled paper or paper of any kind on the inside of this guy because it's going to be spending a whole year outside in my garden. And even though the weatherproof paper mache clay does dry hard as a rock, and it also doesn't get soft when you put it in water or let it get wet the way the original paper mache clay recipe does. But it will absorb water just the way any other cement product does, like the cement walls in my basement. So I don't want a mess of wet paper on the inside of my toad. that doesn't sound like it would work out real good. I just kept working, using the pattern as a guide and some photographs that I was looking at that were on my computer, and just kept going until I thought he looked as much like a toad as he needed to. It's not a museum piece, so I wasn't trying to to get it exact or anything, but it came out okay in the end. Now you want to notice that I didn't put any foil at all on the toes. I needed them to be really skinny. And then I decided that those long, skinny toes just were going to be too easy to crack if I tried covering them up with the outdoor mache. I also remembered from trying to cover up wire with the original paper mache clay recipe that it really doesn't work very well. So I used some Magic Sculpt that I already had here in the house. It's an epoxy clay. Any epoxy clay would work. Now, of course, I didn't actually try using the weatherproof paper mache clay over those toes, so it's entirely possible that it would work just fine. But I did have the Magic Sculpt on hand, and I kind of have fun playing with it, so I went ahead and did the toes, and I covered those styrofoam eyeballs too. I let the Magic Sculpt cure overnight, and then it was time to start mixing up some of the new weatherproof paper mache clay. Now, in the first batch, I actually added 2 additional tablespoons of the Portland cement. I wanted it to be a thicker mixture so that I could sculpt with it a little bit better. It just seemed a little bit too wet when I was making the leaf with it. The leaf turned out really well because the thinness of the material helped catch all the lines on the leaf, all of those veins and everything. But when I actually wanted to sculpt with it, I wanted it to be a little thicker. So I added the 2 tablespoons of Portland cement. Oddly enough, yesterday when I went to mix up some more for the top, I didn't need those additional tablespoons. I don't know if I measured the 1 cup of Portland cement incorrectly, or if I don't know what happened. I just didn't need it. So what I would suggest is go ahead and use the recipe as it's originally written. And once it's mixed up, if you don't feel that it's at the right consistency that you want to use for sculpting, go ahead and add like a tablespoon of Portland cement at a time. Mix it up really good. You might want to do that by hand because it kind of tends to start crawling up the beaters. But just go ahead and add as much as you need to get the consistency that you want. Basically the same way that we do when we're using the original paper mache clay recipe by adding more flour. It seems to work just fine. I spread the material over the bottom. I didn't have to do much sculpting on this part just because you're not really going to see it anyway. And then I also used a little stamp to make those bumps. The way I made it was I used some Sargent's Plastilina that I have. It's just a really soft oil-based modeling clay, and I poked holes in it, just little dips all over it. It's a soft clay, but it is stiff enough so that when I pressed it into the material, it made little bumps, just like toad bumps. So it worked out really well. Now this is the point where I decided that I probably needed something for him to sit on so that I wouldn't crack those toes. Even though they're made with the Magic Sculpt instead of the outdoor mache, I was still a little bit concerned about breaking them. So that's when I started the leaf that I showed you in the previous video. And I also had to do quite a few projects out in the garden because it started getting really hot and I hadn't finished my irrigation system. So it took a while before I was able to get back to my toad and start working on the top again. But when I did, I went ahead and mixed up some more of the recipe. When I started mixing it up, like I said before, it seemed heavier than it had before. I don't know why, but I didn't add any additional cement to it this time. It was already heavy enough or thick enough to be able to sculpt with it. I just went ahead and started in right around the eyeballs. I kept spreading it very thinly, not too thin. I didn't want the aluminum foil to show through, but I did spread it out over everything. I was looking at photographs on my computer to make sure that I was getting things sort of right. And then I did start using the stamp again, the one that's made out of the oil-based clay. I did discover that the stamp works a lot better if you allow the cement-based material to dry a little bit just on the top. It takes maybe, 15 to 20 minutes for it to get not quite as shiny. Like in the areas where I had used the damp knife to smooth everything off, I couldn't go immediately to those places because it was wet and use the stamp effectively. It just kind of stuck to the stamp and it just didn't take the texture correctly. So you do have to be a little bit careful about that, and all the different parts are going to dry at different times if you're using a damp knife to smooth everything out. So I would suggest just go ahead and let it sit after you get a fairly large area, depending on how big a sculpture you're making, of course, but let it just dry out for maybe half an hour and then go back with the stamp if you're using one. That seems to work really well. The material is sculptable for at least 3 hours in a 76-degree environment with high humidity. It's going to be different. every single time you use it, because of course the temperature and the humidity is always going to be different. So you can't really tell exactly how long you have to sculpt with. But it doesn't appear to harden really fast in the bowl, so we do have plenty of time to sculpt. And I'm really enjoying it. It's coming out really smooth. It's really easy to work with. I think actually easier to work with than the Silky Smooth Air Dry Clay recipe, but I'm not really sure why. Of course, once you try it, you might have a different experience than I did, so go ahead and try it out and see what you think. So now, of course, this needs to cure. So in a couple of weeks, I'll go ahead and put out another video showing you how it looks when he's got his paint, and then we'll start the very long experiment to see how well it holds up in the garden. So here's me and my future self again, different shirt. I just wanted to say one more time that I really am enjoying working with this this material. The one thing that you have to be really careful with it, of course, is it does have cement in it, so you don't want to wash out any of your bowls or mixers or anything else out in the sink, because if you do, it will possibly harden underwater. You don't want that happening inside of your pipes, because plumbers are expensive. Now, by the way, I am going to put a link to the leaf video down below and to the video that gives you the actual recipe that I've been using for both the leaf and for the toad, and it's going to be down in the description. Be sure and look for those. I'm not going to repeat the recipe here because you can just easily go find it. And also I want to mention that we got a lot of really good ideas for names for this material. If we decide to not call it just new and improved paper mache clay, I think that the ones that I'm leaning towards, even though there were some really good ones, but the shortest ones and the easiest ones for me to actually remember were garden mache or garden clay, outdoor mache or outdoor clay. I think that's one that I was using several times in the video. And the one that I recently received by email was see, now I forgot already. No, wait. Paper cement clay. That was it. And that one, I'm really drawn to it just because it's really specific. It says exactly what this is. Even though I'm also drawn to the idea of calling it new and improved paper mache clay, I think probably we need something to make it sound like a different recipe, because adding the cement and leaving out the flour really are kind of big things. So to make things really easy for me, I'm hoping that you'll vote on one of those 3 options that I just mentioned, and then whichever one gets the most votes, that's one we'll go with. How's that sound? So go ahead and do that, and in the meantime, I'm actually starting a new project. I haven't really decided what I'm going to do, but I do need a new pattern of one of these guys, either a mask or a sculpture. That's actually what I get paid for rather than experimenting, so I need to get back to work. If you have any ideas for what you think I should work on for my next pattern, be sure and let me know that too, and come back and visit me, ultimatepapermache.com. I'll see you there.